Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 101 Criminal Law Online. Tonight's lecture is going to be Chapter 12, where we are going to be covering false imprisonment, kidnapping, restraint crimes, child abduction, rape, and unlawful sexual intercourse. We have a lot of information to cover, so I'm going to jump into things right away. Also, really quick as a reminder, don't forget about your student resources at the end of the chapter, which will help you study, and also look at some of the scenarios and case studies, if you will, that they have in Chapter 12 that will help you add some context to our conversation or our lecture this evening. So, starting off with false imprisonment, you can find that under Penal Code Section 236, and false imprisonment is the unlawful violation of the personal liberty of another. Now, the essential elements of that will be restraint of the victim's liberty and restraint or imprisonment that must be unlawful. A little side note in there, the restraint must be for some length of time. The courts really don't tell us how long, but it needs to be for some length of time and, of course, against the victim's will. Now, when we look at false imprisonment, remember, just like any other code, we have to look at some of the words that are there. So maybe we need to find out, well, what does really restraint mean? And what does confinement mean? And I think it's a good idea for us to look at those two pieces before we kind of figure out, hey, do we have a case for something like this, if in fact we were looking at some type of investigation. So false imprisonment is basically any unlawful restraint of a person's liberty, and is committed whenever a person detains another by force, actual or constructive, and without his or her consent, and without legal cause. So those two essential elements that are necessary to accomplish this crime are restraint of the victim's liberty and restraint or imprisonment that is in fact unlawful. So what's restraint? Well, false imprisonment requires direct restraint of the person for some length of time, compelling him or her to stay or go somewhere against his or her will. Now, your textbook gives a little bit of a blurb, if you will, on a false arrest. So it says here, a false arrest is one way to commit false imprisonment, i.e., since the arrest involves detention or restraint, it always involves an imprisonment. False arrest and false imprisonment are therefore not separate wrongs. Now, you have to look at the significance that could arise from the possibility of a false arrest, but typically the mere fact that maybe you don't have all of the elements together and you make an arrest doesn't necessarily negate your case, and it doesn't automatically, and very, very, very rarely would actually point to some type of false imprisonment. Okay, but when we look at the wording and the black and white of the text, there is a possibility that that actually could take place. Now, confinement defined means basically that confinement is necessary to constitute imprisonment, and it may consist of confinement in the broadest sense of that term, detention of an individual in a room or building or street or vehicle, or compelling by force or threat of force to go from one place to another, any exercise of force or express or implied threat of force by which in fact the other person is deprived of his or her liberty or is compelled to remain where he or she does not wish to remain or where he or she does not wish to go is technically imprisonment. Now, The restraint may be committed by acts, words, or by both. Now, punishment of false imprisonment we can see is under section 237. It's classified as a misdemeanor, punishable by county jail, and if accompanied by violence, menace, fraud, etc., can be punishable as a felony in the county jail. Some other crimes that are listed in your textbook that are under, I think they start on page like 192 and go through probably 193 or 194, are listed here for you to look at. And we're not going to look at all of these, but these are crimes of restraint, and a couple of interesting ones. And one that is not listed there would be Penal Code section 210.5, which talks about taking hostages. So you ever watch a TV show or a cop show and someone's taken hostage and you kind of wonder, hey, I know the guy committed a robbery or a murder or something, but could he or she actually be prosecuted for some type of restraint crime? Well, Penal Code section 210.5, an act of false imprisonment to prevent arrest which causes an increased risk of harm or to use the person as a shield is a felony. So yes, so taking of a hostage, you could be charged with a restraint crime. So a couple other ones that we'll look at, we're going to take a look at the human trafficking under Penal Code section 236.1. It is a felony to deprive another of his or her liberty with the intent to obtain forced labor, services, or sexual activity accomplished by means of duress, fraud, deceit, coercion, violence, menace, or threat. Now, keep this in mind. Officers who confront suspected prostitutes or victims of false imprisonment, rape, or even domestic violence must really use due diligence to identify possible human trafficking factors, right? Including trauma or fatigue, social withdrawal, fear of interaction, restrictions on movement and habitation, indebtedness to the employer, or third-party control over personal identification documents and things like that. Because human trafficking, this is how people do that. They basically deprive another person of their liberty for forced labor or other services. So when we go out and we arrest prostitutes, or we contact those that are involved in sex crimes or things like that, we always have to look for these other things that might make the case a little bit bigger, if you will, because there might be somebody controlling the efforts through human trafficking or something like that. And then let's take a look at stalking, and then we'll kind of move on. So section 646.9, which actually I think there's a slide that comes up on that. Oh, look at me, and I was right. So because it is an important section, and you're going to see this section every once in a while, especially if you work patrol or investigation. So any person who willfully, maliciously, and repeatedly follows or harasses another person and who makes a credible threat with the intent to place that person in reasonable fear of death or great bodily injury is guilty of the crime of stalking. So when you go back and you look at the elements again, remember how I've kind of taught you to read and to think about those elements. Well, and they're essential elements. That's why they have them listed like this: willfully, maliciously, and repeatedly. So we would have to really know, what does willfully mean? Maybe we need to know what maliciously means. And the code sections will actually spell that out for you. Follow or harass another person. Well, what is harass? Is it just calling them names, or is it something else? And, not or, and makes a credible threat. Well, what's a credible threat? So these are things that you have to look at when you're looking at these types of sections. With the intent to place a person in reasonable fear of death or great bodily injury. Now, this section in itself is a misdemeanor. So now that we've kind of gone through false imprisonment and then a couple other sections that are similar, let's kind of go up the ladder, if you will, a bit, and let's talk a little bit about kidnapping. Kidnapping is basically every person who forcibly or by any other means of instilling fear steals or takes or holds or detains or arrests the person in this state and carries the person to another country, state, or county, or into another part of the same county, is guilty of kidnapping. Now, kidnapping under this section 207A is a general intent crime. No specific reason or purpose intent for the kidnapping is needed to be proved in order for the suspect to be found guilty of kidnapping under this section. So again, if you go back, as I've kind of taught you before, to look at the section and kind of identify those things that maybe you need to, define a little bit further. Every person who forcibly or by other means of instilling fear. Well, what could that be? Could that be threatening them? Threatening their family? So those are things that we have to think about. Steals or takes or holds or detains or arrests any person in the state and carries the person to another country, state, or county, or another part of the county. Now, we just learned kidnapping is a general intent crime, punishable by 3, 5, or 8 years in the state prison. So let's take a look at a couple of key ingredients, if you will, for kidnapping. In kidnapping, the taking is forcible if it's accomplished through the giving of orders which the victim feels compelled to obey. How about do this or I will kill you? Does that kind of make sense? So it doesn't always have to be with some kind of weapon. It actually could be through the spoken word, the threat, the coercion, or something like that. So the taking is considered forcible if it's accomplished through the giving of orders which the victim feels compelled to obey. Forcible taking of a child or an infant is a little bit different. It only requires that amount of force required to basically carry the child away or take the child. And also in kidnapping, movement is required. It has to be there. And the law requires what they call substantial movement. And the name for movement, or the name for movement is called asportation. So a couple other sections that are also listed in that kidnapping area, and I think you'll find them on probably pages 194, would be kidnapping a child under the age of 14, kidnapping for involuntary servitude, bringing a victim into a different state, or multiple offenses. But I want to focus for just a moment on Government Code 8594, and that's in the middle of your slide that you're looking at right now. A law enforcement agency investigating a reported abduction of a child under 18 or a disabled victim shall, absent extenuating investigative needs, request that the California Highway Patrol activate the emergency alert system. And that would be the Amber Alert system that you've probably heard about. Now, this requirement applies where it is determined that the victim is in imminent danger of serious bodily injury or death, and there is information available that could help recover the victim if this is disseminated to the general public. Now, it doesn't apply in non-threatening custody disputes between husband and wife, etc. Okay, or just custody disputes in general. So it has to be, there needs to be that imminent danger factor built in order for this to actually apply. So now that we've talked about just, I guess we'll say, regular kidnapping, let's step it up a little bit and let's look at something a little bit different called kidnapping for ransom, extortion, robbery, or rape. Now, kidnapping a person for the purpose of gaining ransom or for the purposes of extortion, robbery, or rape has committed a serious felony. So anybody that's done that. So every person who seizes, confines, entices, abducts, conceals, kidnaps, or carries away any individual by means whatsoever with the intent to hold or detain, or who holds or detains such individual for ransom, meaning like I'm holding them for money or something, reward, or to commit extortion, or to exact from another person any money or valuable thing, or any person who aids or abets any such act is guilty of a felony, and upon conviction shall be punished by imprisonment in the state prison for life without the possibility of parole. Now, kidnapping for ransom is probably the one part that you've seen the most on TV, where they take someone and they hold them, and then they make the phone call, and the phone call demands money, and there's going to be a drop site, and you bring the money, I'll bring the person, and we'll do the exchange. That's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about kidnapping for ransom. And again, it is in fact punishable by life in prison. Now, when you hear the term risk, because you hear that sometime, risk of harm, that term risk of harm refers to an increase in the odds that the victim may suffer great physical injuries due to forced movement over and above those to which a victim of a robbery is normally exposed. So I just kind of wanted to get that out there as well. And then another type of, it falls under the, not necessarily kidnapping or restraint type crime, but more under the child abduction type sections, if you will, would be things like child stealing, or violation of custody orders, or protective orders, or concealment type sections. And I wanted to focus on just one of these. You can find these on page 196 in your textbook. But child stealing is one that you would probably run into every once in a while as a patrol officer or even a detective. So every person not having a right of custody, so not having a right of custody, who maliciously takes, entices away, detains, or conceals any minor child with intent to detain or conceal such child from a parent, guardian, or public agency having lawful charge of that child is guilty of a felony wobbler, which means, I think we know this, it could be a misdemeanor or a felony. They'll charge it as a felony, but it actually could be a misdemeanor. Okay, so we've finished up the false imprisonment crimes and the restraint crimes, and we've talked about kidnapping and child abduction and Amber Alerts. And now we're going to move on to the last two sections here. We're going to talk about rape and unlawful sexual intercourse. Now, you can find this rape under section 261A. Rape is an act of sexual intercourse accomplished with a person not the spouse of the suspect under the following circumstances. Now, you're probably looking at that going, well, wait a minute. I remember in some class that I sat in, or some news article or something, that, you know what, a spouse can be the victim of a rape, and again, gender doesn't matter, but that spouse can be a victim of a rape, right? And the answer to that is yes, but it's under a different section, and it doesn't have quite as many of the items listed below. So yes, you are correct. A spouse can be the victim of a rape, but not under this particular section. So kind of just go with me on this one, and we'll get to the other one in just a few minutes. So again, rape is an act of sexual intercourse accomplished with a person not the spouse of the perpetrator or suspect under the following circumstances: victim of unsound mind, by force, violence, duress, or menace. Victim is unable to resist due to drugs or intoxication. Victim is unconscious of the nature of the act. By false pretense, they called it artifice, but it means false pretense or fraud or concealment. By threats of retaliation in the future, or by threats to use the authority of a public office. Now, I'm going to go through some of these a little bit, and then we're going to come back as a very quick review. And then we're going to jump into legal consent because it gets a little bit gray in some of these areas, but I want to make sure that you kind of understand these. So I know it's going to take an extra minute, but you know what? That extra minute is worth it. So here is the list of those circumstances. So unsound mind. This subdivision provides that an act of intercourse is rape where the person is incapable of consenting by reason of an unsound mind, and the assailant knows or should have known about it. An example could be where a 21-year-old female with the mentality of, say, 12 years of age gave consent for sexual intercourse. So that, I mean, because of the person's mindset, you can see how that really may not be a valid consent. Forcible, by force or violence or duress. The key element here is that the victim's resistance is overcome by the suspect. Now, the California courts no longer follow the rule that the victim must resist to the utmost, and that's the way it was at common law. It is now sufficient merely to show non-consent by the victim, okay, to the sexual act. Now, force for the purpose of the rape statute does not require proof that it be substantially different or greater that is necessary to accomplish the act itself. It merely need be shown that the act of intercourse was against the victim's will. So hopefully that kind of clears that up. Now, victim unable to resist due to drugs or intoxication. You can find that under Penal Code Section 261A3, and again, we'll kind of go over these in a few minutes. Relative to the victim's resistance being overcome by an intoxicant, anesthetic, or any controlled substance, the key phrase here is being administered by privity, meaning that both parties did not know. Only one party knew. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, if the victim, for example, is voluntarily drunk, it may not fall under this particular circumstance, but it is definitely going to fall under another one, which would be the next one we're going to discuss, which is unconscious of the nature of the act. And you'll understand what I mean in a minute. So let's go to that one. Victim unconscious of the nature of the act. This section punishes one who knowingly takes advantage of a victim who, for whatsoever reason, is unconscious of the nature of the act, and that state may be voluntary or involuntary, induced by ingesting intoxicants or drugs. So if you drank until you couldn't drink anymore and you passed out, and you were the victim of sexual assault, that's where this particular circumstance would come into play. Does that make sense? And that is different from the one above it where we talked about somebody maybe slipping somebody some type of drug or something like that. We talked about that term privity, meaning without joint knowledge. Okay? What about by what they call artifice or fraud? And there's a leading case here, which is really interesting. And I'm not making light of it. It's just the case itself is interesting. So this case was a California case, and it was People versus McCoy. And in this case, the female was the victim of what we're going to call a mock marriage. Somebody set this up, and it was the male person that did it. So she entered into a mock marriage arranged by the male, and and she entered into this in good faith. Therefore, the court found all subsequent acts of sexual relations would constitute, under the section, a violation of rape. So a very interesting law, because the female thought she was actually getting married. It was a mock marriage. And then it was okay at that point in her mind to consummate the marriage. However, it wasn't a real marriage. It was only set up to look that way. Threats of retaliation in the future, that one's actually pretty easy to kind of figure out. This subdivision is similar to a different one, except that the victim's resistance is overcome by fear for her safety or that of another in the future if she doesn't cooperate. So that kind of means like, hey, you know what? I'm going to kill your child if you don't let me do this. That would be a threat in the future. And then the final one would be threats to use the authority of a public office. So what about consent? And then we're going to kind of do a quick review of what we just went over, because I think reviewing is always good. Well, what is consent for the purpose of rape? Okay. Penal Code Section 261.6 says consent is defined as positive cooperation in act or attitude pursuant to an exercise of free will. The person must act freely and voluntary and have knowledge of the nature of the act or transaction involved. Now, 261.7 says evidence that the victim suggested, requested, or otherwise communicated to the defendant that defendant use a condom or other type of birth control device without additional evidence of consent is not sufficient to constitute consent. Does that make sense why that section is there? Because somebody might say, you know what, maybe I don't, they might be victimized, okay, it's going to be a rape, but they're begging the person that's doing it, could you use a condom so A, I don't get a transmitted disease, or B, I don't end up pregnant. Okay, but merely saying that, the court is saying that's not enough to say, hey, it's okay for consent. We need something other than that, because we understand the victim's thought process in that. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Now, we're going to jump back into the review of all of those subsections or circumstances that are listed under rape. So 261A1, unsound mind. This subdivision provides an act of rape where the person is incapable of consenting by reason of unsound mind. The assailant must know or reasonably should have known this. It is still rape even if the victim submits to the act, as long as they're unable to comprehend its true meaning, moral significance, etc. And we have the example of the 22-year-old female with the mentality of a 12-year-old that submits to sexual intercourse. And the court in this People versus Boggs case upheld that particular rape conviction. 261A2, we talk about force. The key element here is that the victim's resistance is overcome by the suspect. And a victim need not resist to, remember, their utmost. They don't have to do that anymore. It's now sufficient merely to show non-consent by the victim. Threats in these types of rape cases does not require any use of a weapon. Okay, so if somebody threatens with a weapon, that in itself would be enough. 261A3, drugs. The key phrase here in this section, remember, would be that phrase administered by or with privity of the accused. And the term privity means without joint knowledge or without the awareness of one of the parties. So if a man slips a roofie pill in a woman's drink and the woman submits to the act of sexual intercourse by being too intoxicated to resist, that would be a good example of that one. Unconsciousness. This section punishes one who knowingly takes advantage of a victim who is unconscious of the act. Such a state may be, remember, voluntary or involuntary. It doesn't matter, intoxicated or impaired. If the victim is voluntarily so drunk that they are unconscious of the act and the assailant knows or reasonably should have known that, this is in fact a violation of this particular section. Fraud. We talked about the example of the mock marriage. So this section provides where fraud is perpetrated or carried out. Such fraud precludes the existence of all valid consent as a matter of law. Retaliation, we talked about that one, similar to section A2, use of force, except that the victim's resistance is overcome by fear for one's safety or that of another in the future if one does not cooperate with the suspect. So a threat to injure the victim's child here, that would suffice. And one other thing, it must appear to the victim that there is a reasonable possibility, just a reasonable possibility, that the suspect will execute the threat in order to make this section valid. And then threats to arrest, this subdivision describes a rape where the victim's resistance is overcome by threatening to use what they call the authority of a public official to have the victim arrested. And the assailant could be a government employee, and I just used the example of police officer. So a couple of other things that fall in line with rape, and we're going to kind of go through these because they are really important for us to understand some of the nuances here that are built into some of these different sections. So for rape, any sexual penetration, however so slight, is sufficient to complete the crime. And I've got the penal code section in there as well, so if you want to look it up to get more information, you totally can. No corroboration is needed in a rape case. A rape may be proved based on uncorroborated testimony of the victim. Now what that means is you don't need 5 other people to testify as witnesses, because typically you aren't going to have those witnesses. Now you might have other evidence, whether it be physical evidence or what have you, to help bolster your case or corroborate the testimony of the victim, but you don't have to have corroborated testimony, okay, in order for this to happen. So no corroboration is required in a rape case. Rape is, the punishment for rape is 3, 6, or 8 years, and those who aid and abet or help without committing the actual act are guilty of a section 264.1 and can actually get up to 9 years in state prison. Now, this is kind of different, and I'm just going to say ooh before I even kind of go there. I'll kind of say it better. Ooh, how's that? Does that kind of help? So penetration of a dead body. Now that's there's a term for that. It's called necrophilia. And it does happen every once in a while, so that's kind of why we're touching on it. So it's not rape, but it is a violation of its own section. Health and Safety Code is where it's found, 7052, which talks about penetration of human remains. Yes, ooh. Or is it better to say ooh? Okay, all right, I can move on now. Now, the use of a foreign instrument for the purpose of sexual intercourse is not rape at all. However, it is a violation of another section, because remember, this is criminal law. We have sections for kind of everything. Section Penal Code Section 289, which talks about penetration by a foreign object. And here's where we talked before. Remember, we talked about rape, and we questioned, I kind of threw out there, well, how come the spouse part isn't in there? Well, the reason is because it actually has its own section. And if you look at the circumstances listed below, there aren't quite as many as the other section, but some of them are in fact the same. So Section 262, rape of a person who is the spouse of a perpetrator or suspect, is an act of sexual intercourse accomplished under the following circumstances: by force, violence, duress, or menace. Victim is unable to resist due to drugs or intoxication. Victim is unconscious of the nature of the act. By threats of retaliation in the future, or by threats to use the authority of a public official. Now, penetration requirements are the same as in the standard rape case, if you will, 261 PC. Penetration, however, so slight, and the punishment is 3, 6, or 8 years in the state prison. So now we're gonna finish up with this section here, unlawful sexual intercourse, and this is where I'm going to ask you to also do a little bit of research. It'll only take you a few minutes. When I'm all done, I'll give you the information that I want you to look up. You don't have to post it on the discussion board, but I want you to be able to get a good understanding, because this is a very, let me say, controversial type section. And the laws, remember, are different from state to state. So what might be considered unlawful sexual intercourse in California may not be in another state. And then I'm going to throw in another curve here in just a second. So let's look at the section first. Penal Code 261.5. Unlawful sexual intercourse is an act of sexual intercourse accomplished with the person, not the spouse of the perpetrator or suspect, where the victim is under 18 years of age. Now, this crime is sometimes called statutory rape. And the reason it's sometimes called statutory rape is because the state does not allow a minor to give legal consent through the statute. So when you're under 18, basically, for the most part, you are under age of legal consent. You can't give legal consent. So statutorily, the way this is written in the statute, you can't consent. Now, the issue that comes out and the debate is that we all know that there are relationships between people that might be 18 years of age and maybe 16 or even 17. Now, I'm not making light of it. I'm not staying on either side of the fence on this. I'm not calling anybody out on it. What I'm saying is that this is a controversial type law, because we know in today's society this takes place. So there are those that believe this should not be criminal, and there are those that believe that it should. So again, it's one of those statutory type things, because someone under 18 in California cannot legally consent. Does that make sense? So what I'd like you to do, well, let me kind of go on before I finish that. So the penetration requirements for this section are the same as in rape 261, and however, though, there are some defenses that are built into the section as well, or that California will recognize, and there are some defenses that other states will recognize that maybe California won't, but will, and vice versa. So a good faith belief that the victim was 18 years of age or older is a valid legal defense. It doesn't get you off the hook, but it is a legal defense. So there's a case out there, People versus Hernandez, and it's a landmark case where a good faith belief that the victim was 18 years of age or over, based on the way she dressed, her obvious physical maturity, coupled with the fact that the victim lied about her age, was then ruled a defense to this crime. So this is just kind of some of that information, these cases that are out there. And again, it's kind of like the debate over marijuana. Some think it's okay, some think it's not. Well, we're talking here about this statutory section when we know that there are, again, relationships between, say, 18 and 17-year-olds, and gender doesn't matter, everybody. It can go both ways, okay? It doesn't really make a difference. So what I want you to do is using whatever search engine that you want to look at, whether it's Google or Yahoo or whatever, look up Jack and Jill laws. And that's just kind of another piece that adds to this discussion of unlawful sexual intercourse. And I want you to take a minute and look that up and see how that applies to this particular section that we are talking about. Does that make sense? If you want to post it on the general discussion board, what you found and what you think, you can totally do that. I didn't make something up for it, but it might be an interesting discussion anyway. But I would like you to really take the time to add some context, again, to this particular issue or crime section, and we'll go from there. Now, the district attorneys and law enforcement, again, they don't have to prosecute every single crime that they come across. So I've seen these things in law enforcement where cases have been filed, and I've seen where cases have not been filed. But this is the law. This is it in black and white. Here are the sections for you to look at, and I'll let you kind of draw your own conclusion on that. And lastly, actually just a couple more really quick items. Fornication, it's in your textbook. It's kind of a couple of definitions that we'll end with here, is sexual intercourse between unmarried male and unmarried female, both of whom are 18 years or over. It's not a crime in California, and the same is true of any other sexual act in California, providing, of course, both parties are 18 or over and both are knowingly consenting to that particular act. So there you have it. So that'll wrap up Chapter 12, false imprisonment, kidnapping, restraint crimes, child abduction, rape, and the ever controversial unlawful sexual intercourse. So with that being said, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them on the discussion board, or if you don't want to post them there, you certainly can email me. And with that, that'll be it for tonight, and until next time.